We now have a class-based component which allows us access to lifecycle methods like component will mount. There's a couple other lifecycle methods that we're going to learn about over time, but for right now we just care about component will mount. As a reminder, component will mount is called the instant this component is about to be placed on the screen of the mobile device, which makes it a fantastic location to start initiating some data loading process for our application. So now we know where we want to make the AJAX request. All that remains is actually making the AJAX request. So we need to somehow make an HTTP request and go fetch our data from this remote API. To make the actual request, fortunately it's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of straightforward actually, not a lot of code for us to write. To do so, we're going to install a library called Axios. So over in my project directory, I'm inside of albums right now, I'm going to install the Axios library by using npm. So I'll write out npm install -- save Axios. So the sole purpose of Axios for us is just to make an HTTP request to fetch some data. That is all we're using it for here. So after the installation is complete, there we go, fantastic. We'll flip back over to our component and we need to import that library into this file right here. Remember, just installing it doesn't do anything for us. We actually have to import it into our file. So at the top, we will import Axios from Axios. Then inside of component will mount, I'm going to take out the console log statement. We don't really need it anymore. And instead, we will make our HTTP request. To make a GET request, like a GET type request, which is going to be used to fetch our data, we will use axios.get, and then we just have to pass in the URL to our remote API. So if you recall, it is HTTPS. Make sure, please, 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 that you are using HTTPS here, not HTTP. // was it course API? No. Okay, I need to go double check. rallycoding.herokuapp.com. I was way off there. Okay, rallycoding.herokuapp. Make sure that you have Heroku app, not just Heroku.com /API/music albums. Cool. So whenever we make an HTTP request with Axios, making an actual request, or this function call right here, returns a promise back to us. It returns a promise because making an HTTP request is inherently asynchronous. So we need to use a promise to get some type of notification that, oh hey, like AJAX request or HTTP request is now complete. Our data's here. Here you go. So we will chain on a .then statement, and to this .then we will pass a function. And so the whole purpose of the promise here is that this function that we pass to .then will be called once the HTTP request is complete. So it will be called with the response from that API. So let's put on response, and for now we'll just console log it. We'll see what we're working with. Okay. All right. So I'm going to flip over to our debugger. So here's our debugger. And I'll refresh the simulator. So my expectation is that when I refresh our simulator, it will automatically make our HTTP request, and I should see the data pop up in our console. So I'll refresh, and eventually something's going to happen. There we go. Okay, very good. So now here's my console log. I can expand this. So this is the response object that was passed back to us from Axios. So I see a status of 200, which means, hey, request successful, everything's good to go. And you'll notice I have this data property right here. So if I expand data, I've got 5 entries, and each one is an individual album. Fantastic. That's it. That's the data that we need to show inside of our application. So this is exactly what we need. So it looks like we're all set. Oh, you know what? I totally forgot. We would be set if it wasn't for one tiny little problem. Just a tiny little problem here. I'm going to pull open a diagram really quick. All right. So we got one just tiny little issue that we're gonna have to figure out here. I want to walk through the timeline of our application right now. Okay, I wanna walk through it and figure out what's going on. So going down is time. So first we start up our application and then basically some stuff happens. So let's walk through it step by step. When we refresh the simulator, React Native boots up and it says, okay, I'm booting up. I need to show that app component on the screen. I'm gonna go ahead and render it. When we render the app component, it renders itself, it renders the header, and it renders the album list. When the album list gets rendered, it says, I'm a class-based component. I'm about to be rendered to the screen, and I have a lifecycle method called component will mount. I'm supposed to call that, so I'm going to call it component will mount. So component will mount is executed, and inside of there we've got some amount of code that is going to issue an HTTP request. So we make the HTTP request using Axios. Now the key here, the thing that I want to really keep your mind on, is that when we make an HTTP request that is inherently asynchronous, and by asynchronous I mean it takes some amount of time to complete that network request. And we have no idea how long it's going to take, especially on a mobile device. It might take 50 milliseconds, it might take 50 seconds on the mobile device. We have no idea. So the instant after we make that HTTP request, the request is still pending. It's still just kind of sitting out there on the wire. And immediately after that, our app component, our album list component, and our header component appear on the screen. And at that point in time, the album list is completely empty. It has no data whatsoever, right? Of course, we don't really have any JS, we just have like the text in there, but in theory, if we had some logic in there to render a list of albums, at the point in time that the album list first renders, it has no data to show on the screen. Okay, so then, kind of the ... which means we're waiting for the request to complete. After some number of milliseconds, our HTTP request completes and we get back some JSON data. And that data is the stuff we actually want to show on the screen. And so here's the key, here's the big issue, here's what's going wrong. We have an order of operations problem. We make our HTTP request, we try to render some stuff at the screen, we have no data to show, and then sometime later we actually get our data. And right now, as it stands right now, we have absolutely no logic in there whatsoever to say, oh, our AJAX request just completed, we need to re-render our component somehow. We need to take this data and actually show it on the screen. We have zero logic for that whatsoever. So that is what the big problem is. We need to figure out some way to make our album list re-render a second time when our HTTP request completes and we've got some data to show on the screen. So that's essentially it. That's our big issue. We need to figure out how to tell the album list to re-render. So this is a big challenge. Let's continue in the next section and figure out how we're going to solve it.